Welcome, find yourself somewhere comfortable, somewhere soft and still. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow. Tonight, we are going somewhere most history classes never take you. We are slipping through the cracks of the official record, past the famous battles and the memorized kings, into the stranger, quieter, more surprising corners of British history. These are 100 rare facts about the United Kingdom, the kind of details that rarely make it into textbooks, the stories that most people have never heard, gathered from centuries of extraordinary events that shaped not just Britain, but the entire world. So breathe in slowly, breathe out. Let the weight of the day fall away from you, and let us begin. Fact number 1. England's first king was not William the Conqueror. Most people, when asked who the first king of England was, will say William the Conqueror, the Norman who famously defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But that answer is actually wrong, and the real story begins more than a century earlier. The first true king of a unified England was a man named Athelstan, who ruled from 927 until his death in 939. Athelstan was the grandson of Alfred the Great, and he spent his reign systematically bringing together the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Viking-controlled territories of England under a single crown. He defeated a coalition of enemies at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a victory so significant that it was celebrated in poetry for generations. He also established diplomatic ties across Europe, corresponded with rulers in France and Germany, and created legal codes that unified his kingdom. When Athelstan died, he had created something that had never existed before, a single coherent England. Fact number 2. The Black Death may have killed half of England's population. When the plague arrived in England in the summer of 1348, sailing in on merchant ships docking at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, it moved with a speed and ferocity that no one in the medieval world had ever witnessed. Within 18 months, it had swept across the entire country, reaching every village, every town, every monastery and castle. The disease, now understood to have been primarily bubonic plague spread by fleas on rats, killed its victims within days, sometimes hours. Historians have debated the death toll for generations, and the numbers they arrive at are genuinely staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that somewhere between a third and a half of England's entire population died in that first outbreak. Some regions lost even more. Certain villages were wiped out entirely, their names surviving only in old land records. The labour force collapsed, fields went unplanted, crops rotted. In the years that followed, the social order of medieval England began to shift in ways that would take decades to fully understand. Fact number 3. There was once a king of England who spoke almost no English. Richard the Lionheart, King Richard I of England, is one of the most celebrated figures in English history. Statues of him stand outside the Houses of Parliament. He is remembered as a warrior king, a crusader, a symbol of English courage and chivalry. But here is something almost nobody mentions when they tell his story. Richard I spoke virtually no English. He was raised in the Duchy of Aquitaine in what is now southern France, and his mother tongue was Occitan, a language of southern France. He was also fluent in French. He spent only about 6 months of his entire 10-year reign actually on English soil. England, to Richard, was largely a source of revenue to fund his military campaigns in the Holy Land and his wars in France. He once reportedly said that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. He squeezed the country for taxes, levied enormous sums, and then left again. And yet the legend grew, century after century, until Richard became the very embodiment of English kingship. Fact number 4. The Great Fire of London may have been started by a baker's oversight. On the 2nd of September 1666, in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the City of London, a fire began in the early hours of the morning. The exact cause has never been definitively proven, but the leading theory is simply that the baker, Thomas Fariner, failed to properly extinguish his oven before going to bed. The fire spread with horrifying speed through the closely packed timber frame buildings of the old medieval city, fanned by a strong easterly wind and fed by months of dry summer weather. Over 4 days, the fire burned roughly 373 acres of the city, destroying around 13,200 houses, 87 churches including the original St. Paul's Cathedral, and dozens of other buildings, and yet, officially, only 6 people died. This number has always seemed implausibly low to historians, and many believe that the deaths of poorer citizens who left no records were simply never counted. What the fire did leave behind was a blank canvas, and the architect Christopher Wren was given the opportunity to design a new, more orderly city of stone and brick. Fact number 5. England was once ruled by a Viking who also ruled Denmark and Norway. His name was Knut, and he is one of the most underrated rulers in British history. In the year 1016, after years of war between the Danish Vikings and the Anglo-Saxon English, Knut became king of England at the age of roughly 21, but he did not stop there. By 1028, he was also king of Denmark and king of Norway, making him the ruler of a vast North Sea empire that stretched from the coast of Scandinavia all the way to the border of Scotland. Canute proved to be a remarkably effective ruler of England. He governed fairly, maintained peace, upheld English laws, and even went on pilgrimage to Rome, presenting himself as a devout Christian king. He is most famous today for the story of the waves, the legend in which he sat on a throne at the edge of the sea and commanded the tide not to come in. The story is almost always told as an example of his arrogance, but the original version of the tale was actually the opposite. Fact number 6. The plague returned to England more than 20 times after the Black Death. Most people know about the Black Death of 1348 as a single catastrophic event, something that happened and then ended. But the plague did not end. It returned to England repeatedly, in waves, for more than 3 centuries. Outbreaks struck in 1361, 1369, 1374, 1390, and again through the 15th and 16th centuries. Each outbreak killed fewer people than the great initial wave, partly because survivors and their descendants had some degree of immunity, but the cumulative effect on English society was enormous. The population of England, which had been somewhere around 4 to 6 million before 1348, did not fully recover to pre-plague levels until well into the 16th century, roughly 200 years after the first outbreak. The most famous later outbreak was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed roughly 100,000 people in the city alone, about a quarter of London's population at the time. Samuel Pepys wrote about it in his diary. Fact number 7. England once executed a king in front of a large crowd. The execution of King Charles I of England on the 30th of January 1649 was one of the most shocking events in European history. No English king had ever been publicly tried and executed before. The very idea that a monarch could be brought before a court, found guilty of treason, and beheaded was considered an outrage by most of the crowned heads of Europe. Charles I had ruled as king since 1625, and his reign had been defined by his absolute belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs answered only to God and not to Parliament. His conflicts with Parliament led to the English Civil War, a brutal and deeply divisive conflict that split families, communities, and the country. When Parliament's forces won, led by Oliver Cromwell, the decision was made to try the king. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority throughout his trial. He was found guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, and murderer. Fact number 8. The Tower of London has housed polar bears, lions, and elephants. The Tower of London is famous as a fortress, a royal palace, a prison, and a place of execution. But for roughly 600 years, from the early 13th century until 1835, it was also a zoo. The Royal Menagerie at the Tower of London was one of the oldest collections of exotic animals in Britain, and its origins trace back to 1210, when King John reportedly kept a collection of exotic beasts there. The collection grew significantly in 1235 when the Holy Roman Emperor sent Henry III 3 leopards as a diplomatic gift, followed later by a polar bear and an elephant. The polar bear was reportedly allowed to fish in the Thames on a long chain. The elephant, which arrived in 1255, was the first ever seen in England and caused an enormous sensation. Over the centuries, the menagerie included lions, tigers, wolves, monkeys, kangaroos, and a wide assortment of birds. Public admission was available, and at various points, visitors could pay their entrance fee either in money or by bringing a cat or dog to feed to the lions. Fact number 9. A woman once ruled England for 9 days and then lost her head. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and her story is one of the most tragic in English history. Jane was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, which made her a distant relative of the Tudor line of succession. In 1553, when the young King Edward VI was dying, his chief advisor John Dudley, whose son had married Jane, manipulated the succession to prevent the Catholic Mary Tudor from taking the throne. Jane was proclaimed queen on the 9th of July, 1553. She was 16 years old, reportedly deeply reluctant to accept the crown, and had made no moves to secure her position. Within 9 days, the popular support for Mary Tudor had proved overwhelming. Mary marched on London, Jane's support collapsed, and Jane was imprisoned in the Tower. Initially, Mary seems to have intended to spare Jane's life. But when Jane's father participated in a Protestant rebellion against Mary in early 1554, the decision was made to execute Jane to remove her as a potential figurehead for future rebellions. She was beheaded on the 12th of February 1554. Fact number 10. The English once banned Christmas. For roughly a decade in the mid-17th century, celebrating Christmas was officially discouraged, and in some respects prohibited in England. After the execution of Charles I and the establishment of the Puritan Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, Parliament moved to suppress what it considered ungodly festivities. In 1647, Parliament passed an ordinance abolishing Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun as public holidays, replacing them with a monthly fast day. Soldiers were ordered to enforce the closure of shops on Christmas Day. The reasoning was partly theological, since Puritans believed that the Bible gave no instruction to celebrate Christ's birth, and that the festivities had become an excuse for drunkenness, feasting, and general disorder, and partly political, since Christmas was associated with the old royalist culture they had overthrown. In many towns, enforcement was sporadic and met with real resistance. There were riots in Canterbury when soldiers tried to stop Christmas celebrations. People decorated their doors with holly in defiance. Fact number 11. Britain's oldest road is older than Stonehenge. The Ridgeway, a long-distance trackway running across the chalk downlands of southern England, is often described as Britain's oldest road, and its origins stretch back at least 5,000 years, predating Stonehenge by centuries. The path follows the high ground of the Berkshire and Marlborough Downs, offering ancient travellers a dry, navigable route above the marshy valley floors. Along its length, the Ridgeway passes some of Britain's most extraordinary prehistoric monuments, including the Uffington White Horse, a massive chalk figure carved into a hillside that is roughly 3,000 years old, and Wayland's Smithy, a Neolithic burial chamber that is even older. The route continues past the great prehistoric hill fort of Barbary Castle, and eventually links to the Icknield Way, another ancient track that reaches all the way to the Norfolk coast. Prehistoric people walked this path carrying flint, pottery, and livestock. Bronze Age traders used it. Iron Age farmers followed its line. Roman soldiers marched along stretches of it. Fact number 12. Henry VIII did not actually break with Rome over Anne Boleyn. The popular story of the English Reformation goes like this. Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused. Henry got angry, declared himself head of the Church of England, and broke with Rome. The end. But this version leaves out the deeper, messier, and far more interesting reality. Henry's theological break with Rome was shaped by a complex mix of political ambition, financial calculation, genuine religious debate, and personal desire, in proportions that historians still argue about. The dissolution of the monasteries that followed the break with Rome was enormously profitable for the crown, bringing in vast amounts of land and wealth. Henry's advisors, particularly Thomas Cromwell, were influenced by Protestant and humanist ideas circulating across Europe. The break with Rome was also a consolidation of royal power, removing a foreign authority from English religious and political life. Henry himself, ironically, was not a Protestant. Fact number 13. An entire village in Dorset was abandoned because of a landslide. The village of Tyneham in Dorset has one of the most unusual histories of any English settlement. But before we reach the modern part of its story, its very landscape tells an older tale. The Dorset coast in this region is one of the most geologically unstable in Britain, prone to dramatic landslips that have, over centuries, swallowed buildings, roads, and farmland. In 1839, the nearby coastal area experienced one of the largest landslips in British history, when a section of cliff collapsed into the sea in a single night, creating a completely new landscape of jumbled rock, sunken fields, and displaced earth. Fishermen reported hearing the sound of the earth moving from miles away. The resulting feature, now called the Undercliff, became a nature reserve of extraordinary botanical richness, a tangled, subtropical-feeling wilderness that novelist John Fowles used as the setting for his novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman. Tyneham itself met a different fate entirely. In 1943, the entire village was requisitioned by the British Army for use as a training ground. Fact number 14. The original London Bridge kept severed heads on display for centuries. The medieval London Bridge, which stood for roughly 6 centuries from the 1170s until it was replaced in the 19th century, was one of the great engineering achievements of its age, but it was also the site of one of the most macabre traditions in English history. From the late medieval period onward, the heads of executed traitors were placed on spikes above the gatehouse at the southern end of the bridge, preserved with tar to slow their decay, and displayed as a warning to all who entered the city. The practice continued for roughly 400 years. At various points in history, the heads of some of England's most significant figures were displayed there, including Sir Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and various rebels and conspirators. Contemporary visitors, including foreign diplomats and travellers, wrote about the grisly display with a mixture of horror and fascination. By the Elizabethan period, it was reportedly not uncommon for there to be 30 or more heads on display at any given time. Fact number 15. Scotland's national animal is the unicorn. If you were choosing a national animal for Scotland, you might expect a golden eagle, or perhaps a red deer, or some equally rugged creature suited to the Highland landscape. But Scotland's official national animal is the unicorn, a mythological beast that has never existed outside of legend. The unicorn appears in Scottish heraldry dating back to the 12th century, and it became a symbol of royal power and purity. In the arms of Scotland, the unicorn is depicted wearing a crown and bound by a golden chain, which, according to tradition, is because a free unicorn is considered so fierce and wild that only a magical chain can restrain it. The unicorn was also believed to be the natural enemy of the lion, which was the symbol of England, making its adoption by Scotland a statement of fierce independence. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, uniting the two crowns, the arms of Great Britain combined the English lion with the Scottish unicorn. Fact number 16. The English language would not exist without the Viking invasions. The English language as we know it is the product of layer upon layer of different linguistic influences, and the contribution of the Vikings is far greater than most people realize. When Danish and Norwegian Vikings began settling in large parts of northern and eastern England from the 9th century onwards, they brought with them their Old Norse language, and it fused with the Old English spoken by the Anglo-Saxon population in ways that fundamentally shaped the language we speak today. Some of the most basic everyday words in modern English come from Old Norse. The words sky, knife, window, husband, law, wrong, ugly, anger, happy, and egg all have Old Norse origins. The word they and their comes from Old Norse, replacing the Old English equivalent. Even the word berserk, now used casually to describe wild behavior, comes from the Norse word for a specific type of Viking warrior who fought in a wild, trance-like state. The influence was not just in individual words, but in grammar and structure. Fact number 17. Britain was once covered by a vast tropical forest. This is a fact that requires you to stretch your imagination of deep time. Around 300 million years ago, the landmass that would eventually become Britain lay near the equator in a hot, humid, tropical climate. It was covered by dense swamp forests, vast jungles of giant ferns, club mosses, and primitive trees that grew up to 30 meters tall. The creatures that lived among these forests included enormous dragonflies with wingspans of up to 70 centimeters, millipedes that grew to 2.5 meters in length, and amphibians that were the dominant large animals of their age. Over millions of years, these forests died and accumulated in thick layers of decaying vegetation. Compressed under sediment and transformed by heat and pressure over geological time, they became coal. The coal seams that powered Britain's Industrial Revolution, the same coal that was mined from the valleys of Wales and the hills of Yorkshire and the fields of the Midlands for 2 centuries, is the fossilized remains of those ancient tropical forests. Fact number 18. The English once invaded Iceland. This is a largely forgotten episode of English history, but it is a fascinating one. In the early 15th century, English fishermen from ports like Bristol and Hull began fishing illegally in Icelandic waters, which were then under the control of the Danish crown. The fishing stocks around Iceland, particularly cod, were enormously valuable, and the English were catching huge quantities without paying the Danish tolls. When diplomatic protests failed to stop them, the situation escalated. In 1425, an English fishing fleet landed on Iceland and actually seized the Danish governor, John Craxton. The Danish king complained bitterly to the English crown. The conflict, sometimes called the English-Danish fishing wars, or occasionally the cod wars of the 15th century, simmered for decades, with English fishermen regularly clashing with Danish authorities and occasionally each other. Fact number 19. The Welsh language is one of the oldest living languages in Europe. Welsh, or Cymric as it is known to its speakers, is a member of the Brittonic branch of the Celtic languages, and it is one of the oldest continuously spoken languages in Europe. Its roots lie in the language spoken by the Celtic peoples of Britain before the Roman conquest, a language that has survived 2,000 years of invasion, conquest, suppression, and political change. The oldest surviving Welsh poetry dates to around the 6th century, making it roughly contemporary with the earliest written Old English. There are poems in Welsh from that period that refer to specific battles and historical events, including a long and moving elegy for warriors who died at a battle in what is now Edinburgh. Welsh survived the Norman conquest, the Tudor suppression of Welsh culture, centuries of English political dominance, and the industrial transformation of South Wales. In the 19th and 20th centuries, efforts were made to discourage Welsh in schools, with children reportedly punished for speaking their native language. Fact number 20. Britain's worst natural disaster in recorded history was a flood. On the 27th of January 1607, a catastrophic flood struck the low-lying coastal areas of the Bristol Channel and the Severn Estuary, killing an estimated 2,000 people and devastating communities across an enormous stretch of coastline from Devon in the southwest to Pembrokeshire in Wales. The water moved with extraordinary speed, reportedly traveling faster than a horse could gallop, and swept several miles inland in some areas. Hundreds of villages were inundated. Livestock were drowned in enormous numbers. Churches, where people had taken refuge in the belief that God would protect them, were submerged to their rooftops. Contemporary accounts describe harrowing scenes of people clinging to trees and floating timbers as the water rose around them. The cause of the flood was debated for centuries. Some historians attributed it to an exceptionally high tide combined with storm surge. More recently, researchers have proposed that it may have been caused by a tsunami, triggered by an earthquake or submarine landslide off the coast of Ireland. Fact number 21. Shakespeare invented thousands of words we still use today. William Shakespeare was not merely a playwright. He was also one of the most prolific and creative inventors of new words in the history of the English language. Scholars who have studied his plays and poems have identified well over 1,700 words and phrases that appear for the first time in his written works, and many of these have become so thoroughly embedded in everyday English that we no longer think of them as inventions at all. The words bedroom, lonely, generous, gloomy, radiance, swagger, obscene, lackluster, and watchdog were either coined or popularized by Shakespeare. The phrase green-eyed monster, used to describe jealousy, comes from Othello. Cold-blooded comes from King John. Break the ice comes from the taming of the shrew. Good riddance comes from Troilus and Cressida. In the twinkling of an eye comes from the Merchant of Venice. Wild goose chase comes from Romeo and Juliet. The list goes on and on. Fact number 22. Roman soldiers from North Africa once guarded Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall, the great fortification built across the north of England in the 2nd century AD, is often imagined as a barrier manned by Roman soldiers, who looked broadly similar to the people of Britain today. But the Roman army was an extraordinarily diverse institution, drawing soldiers from every corner of the empire, and the units that were stationed along Hadrian's Wall over the centuries of its occupation came from places that might genuinely surprise you. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms that troops from North Africa, specifically a unit from the region of Mauritania in what is now Morocco and Algeria, was stationed at a fort called Abalava, now known as Berg by Sands, on the western section of Hadrian's Wall. There were also Syrian archers stationed at various points along the wall, troops from the Danube region, from the Rhine, from Spain, and from the Low Countries. Fact number 23. The British invented the concentration camp. This is one of the most disturbing and least taught facts in British history, and it concerns the Second Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, which was fought between 1899 and 1902, when the British Army found that it could not defeat the guerrilla tactics of the Boer fighters by conventional military means. The General Lord Kitchener ordered a systematic scorched earth policy. Boer farmsteads were burned, their crops destroyed, and the women, children, and elderly who lived on those farms were rounded up and placed in enclosed camps. These camps, which were officially called concentration camps, a term the British themselves used, were catastrophically mismanaged. The camps were overcrowded, food supplies were inadequate, and sanitation was primitive. Disease spread rapidly. Between 1900 and 1902, approximately 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, out of a total imprisoned population of roughly 116,000. A further 20,000 black South Africans died in separate camps. Fact number 24. England was once part of the Roman Empire for nearly 4 centuries. When Julius Caesar made his 2 brief expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, they were reconnaissance raids rather than conquests. The real Roman conquest of Britain began in 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius, and it was followed by nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule that transformed the island in ways that are still visible today. The Romans built cities, roads, aqueducts, temples, bathhouses, and forums. They introduced new crops, new animals, new building techniques, and new gods. The city of London, then called Londinium, was founded by the Romans and grew into the largest city in Roman Britain, with a population that may have reached 50,000 at its peak. Bath, known as Aquae was built around the only naturally hot spring in England and became a major religious and recreational centre. The Romans withdrew their legions from Britain in 410 AD, and the departure was so sudden and so complete that the Roman infrastructure they left behind gradually fell into disrepair and was slowly absorbed or forgotten. Fact number 25. The first English novel may have been written by a woman. The question of what constitutes the first English novel is a matter of considerable debate among literary scholars, but one strong contender for the title is a work called The Blazing World, written by Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, and published in 1666. The Blazing World is a remarkable work of proto-science fiction, describing a woman who travels through a portal near the North Pole to a different world, where she becomes empress and encounters beings that are part human and part animal. It blends political philosophy, scientific speculation, and vivid imaginative storytelling in ways that feel genuinely modern. Cavendish was an extraordinary figure, one of the first women to be allowed to attend a meeting of the Royal Society, which had been founded just years earlier and which was then exclusively male. She was mocked by some of her contemporaries as Mad Madge, but she published prolifically on subjects ranging from natural philosophy to poetry to plays. Fact number 26. Britain has more castles per square mile than almost any country on Earth. Walk across the British landscape long enough and you will never be far from a castle. Britain has approximately 1,500 castles that are still standing or in ruins, and an estimated 4,000 sites where castles once existed. Wales alone, a country smaller than many Australian states, has around 600 castle sites, more per square mile than almost anywhere else in the world. The proliferation of castles in Britain reflects the extraordinary turbulence of its medieval history. The Norman conquest of 1066 was followed by a rapid castle-building program as the Normans consolidated their control over a hostile population. Every significant Norman baron built a castle to dominate the surrounding countryside. As power shifted through the medieval period, new castles were built and old ones were expanded or abandoned. The border region between England and Scotland, the most contested piece of real estate in British history, is particularly dense with fortifications. Fact number 27. The Industrial Revolution began with a single cotton mill in Derbyshire. The story of the Industrial Revolution is vast and complex, but it has a specific beginning that is often overlooked. In 1771, a clockmaker's apprentice from Preston named Richard Arkwright, working with a stocking manufacturer named Jedediah Strutt and a clockmaker named John Smalley, opened the world's first water-powered cotton mill at a place called Cromford in Derbyshire. The mill used Arkwright's water frame, a machine he had invented to spin cotton thread mechanically, powered by the fast-flowing waters of the River Derwent. Before Cromford, cotton spinning was done by hand in people's homes. After Cromford, it began to be done by machines and purpose-built factories. Arkwright's mill at Cromford was the template for an entirely new form of economic organization, bringing workers together in a single building, under a single roof, working regular hours to the rhythm of machines, rather than the seasons. He became fabulously wealthy. Other entrepreneurs copied his model. Fact number 28, the British Empire at its peak controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. At its greatest extent, reached in the years following the First World War, the British Empire covered approximately 24% of the Earth's total land area and contained roughly 23% of the world's population. It was, quite simply, the largest empire in human history. The empire included territories on every inhabited continent, from Canada in the west to Hong Kong in the east, from the Caribbean in the south to the Arctic territories of northern Canada in the north. At its heart was a relatively small island nation off the coast of northwestern Europe, whose population never exceeded about 40 million people during the height of empire. The mechanisms by which a small island controlled so much of the planet included naval power, commercial enterprise, technological advantage, military force, and diplomatic manipulation. Fact number 29. England's oldest university was founded by students who fled Paris. Oxford University is the oldest university in the English-speaking world, and its origins trace back to the late 12th century. But its existence was not inevitable. In the 1160s, there were already English scholars studying and teaching in Paris, which was at that time the preeminent center of learning in Europe. When a diplomatic dispute between King Henry II of England and King Louis VII of France led Henry to recall all English students from Paris in 1167. Those scholars came home and gathered in Oxford, which already had some tradition of scholarly activity. The concentration of masters and students at Oxford grew rapidly, and the university as an institution gradually took shape over the following decades. There was a further significant boost to the development of Oxford in 1209, when a dispute between townspeople and scholars in Oxford led to a riot, the killing of several scholars, and an exodus of Oxford masters and students to Cambridge, which is how Cambridge University was founded. Fact number 30. The plague pit beneath London is one of the largest in the world. When engineers were excavating the site for a new station on the Crossrail line in central London in 2013, they discovered something extraordinary. Beneath the streets of Liverpool Street, they found a burial ground containing the remains of more than 3,000 individuals, many of them victims of the Black Death outbreak of 1348. The burial ground, which was part of a medieval hospital cemetery known as the New Churchyard, was one of several plague pits created in London during the catastrophic epidemic. In the years since then, more excavation work on the Crossrail and other infrastructure projects has continued to reveal the extraordinary quantity of human remains that lie beneath central London. The New Churchyard alone contained burials from multiple plague outbreaks, from the 14th through the 17th centuries. Forensic analysis of the remains has provided invaluable information about the lives and deaths of medieval and early modern Londoners, including evidence about diet, disease, occupation, and the physical demands of daily life. Breathe gently. Half of our journey is complete. We are moving now through the deeper centuries, the further reaches of Britain's past, each story a small light in the long corridor of time. Let the stories settle softly as we continue. Fact number 31. The first English newspaper was published in the 17th century. The history of English journalism begins in the early 17th century, when the first regular newspapers began to appear. The very first English-language newspaper was not published in England at all, but in Amsterdam, where a news pamphlet called the Courante was printed in 1620 for distribution to English merchants. Regular printed news books, which were the forerunners of newspapers, began appearing in England itself in 1621. The first newspaper in the modern sense, with regular publication, a consistent format, and dated editions, was Mercurius Aulicus, a royalist publication during the English Civil War in 1642. Its parliamentary rival, Mercurius Britannicus, appeared shortly after. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the press was placed under strict government licensing, which limited what could be published. When the Licensing Act lapsed in 1695, the press became freer, and newspapers proliferated rapidly. The Daily Current, founded in 1702, is generally considered the first daily newspaper in England, running news without commentary. Fact number 32. The ancient Britons practiced a religion that left almost no written records. The Druids, who served as the religious and intellectual class of the Celtic peoples of ancient Britain, practiced a religion and a system of knowledge that was entirely oral. They deliberately refused to write down their teachings, their rituals, their mythology, or their histories. The Greek and Roman writers who described them noted this practice with curiosity, explaining that Druids believed writing would weaken memory, and that some knowledge was too sacred to be committed to writing. The consequence of this decision for historians is profound. Almost everything we know about the religion of the ancient Britons comes from the writings of their enemies, the Romans, who had strong reasons to portray the Druids as barbaric and dangerous. Julius Caesar described the Druids as conducting human sacrifices and burning victims alive in wicker structures, a description that has shaped the popular image of Druidism ever since. Whether this description was accurate, exaggerated, or fabricated for political purposes is impossible to know with certainty. Fact number 33. The Great Wall of China is not the only ancient wall in Britain. Hadrian's Wall, built on the orders of the Emperor Hadrian beginning in 122 AD and running 73 miles from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east, is one of the most impressive examples of Roman engineering in Britain and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But it is not the only great Roman wall in Britain. In 142 AD, the Emperor Antoninus Pius ordered the construction of a second wall further north, the Antonine Wall, which crossed what is now central Scotland from the Firth of Forth in the east to the Firth of Clyde in the west, a distance of about 39 miles. The Antonine Wall was built of turf rather than stone and was defended by a series of forts along its length. It represented the most northerly frontier of the Roman Empire and was occupied for roughly 20 years before the Romans pulled back to Hadrian's Wall. The Antonine Wall is less famous than Hadrian's Wall, but equally significant as a historical monument. It was also designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008. Fact number 34. Britain's most northerly point is closer to Norway than to London. Duncansby Head, the most northeasterly point of the Scottish mainland, sits in Caithness at the very top of Scotland. From there, the Norwegian coast is approximately 500 kilometres away. London is roughly 900 kilometres to the south. This geographical fact has important consequences for understanding British history. The northern islands of Scotland, Orkney and Shetland were not even part of Scotland until 1468, when the King of Denmark and Norway pledged them as security against a dowry payment for his daughter's marriage to the Scottish king, a payment that was never made. Before that, Orkney and Shetland had been part of the Norse world for 500 years. The people of Orkney spoke a language called Norn, a descendant of Old Norse, until it died out in the 18th century. Place names throughout Orkney and Shetland are almost entirely Norse in origin. The landscape, the archaeology, and the culture of these islands reflects their history as part of the Scandinavian world, far more than their subsequent history as part of Britain. Fact number 35. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was visited by a third of Britain's population. In 1851, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, organised an extraordinary event in Hyde Park, London. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations was held in a vast, purpose-built glass and iron structure called the Crystal Palace, designed by the engineer and gardener Joseph Paxton. The building itself was revolutionary, covering more than 90,000 square meters of ground and enclosing living elm trees within its glass walls. The exhibition ran for 141 days, from the 1st of May to the 11th of October, and it attracted over 6 million visitors. In a country of roughly 21 million people, this meant that approximately 1 in 3 of Britain's entire population attended. The exhibition displayed 100,000 objects from manufacturers and craftsmen from around the world, celebrating the products of industry, craftsmanship, and technology. It was a statement of Victorian confidence in progress, a celebration of what the industrial age had produced and what the future might hold. Fact number 36. Britain's first printing press was set up by a merchant who learned to print in Belgium. William Caxton was not a scholar or an intellectual. He was a successful wool merchant from Kent who had spent years in the Low Countries trading on behalf of English merchants. In the 1470s, while living in Bruges, he encountered the new technology of printing with movable type, which had been developed by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany around 1450. Caxton learned to print, set up his own press in Bruges, and printed the first book in English, a translation of a French text about the history of Troy, in 1473 or 1474. In 1476, he returned to England and set up the first printing press in Britain in Westminster, close to the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey. Over the remaining years of his life, he printed approximately 100 books, including the first printed editions of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Thomas Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur, and various works of translation from French and Latin. Fact number 37. Britain experienced its own witch trial panic long before Salem. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts are among the most famous episodes of mass hysteria in history. But Britain experienced its own periods of intensive witch persecution that were both earlier and more deadly. Between 1644 and 1646, a man named Matthew Hopkins conducted a systematic campaign of witch-finding across East Anglia that led to the execution of approximately 300 people, most of them women. Hopkins, who gave himself the title Witchfinder General, traveled from town to town, offering his services to local authorities who were already gripped by fear and suspicion. His methods included sleep deprivation, searching for witches' marks, and swimming tests in which an accused person was thrown into water with the logic that water, being pure, would reject a witch. Hopkins made considerable money from his activities and operated largely without official sanction, exploiting the disruption and anxiety of the English Civil War period. Fact number 38. The British Navy once employed women as code breakers during both World Wars. The role of women in British intelligence work during the two World Wars was substantial, and it has only recently begun to receive the recognition it deserves. During the First World War, a significant number of women worked as code breakers in Room 40 at the Admiralty in London, which was the British Naval Intelligence Division responsible for intercepting and decoding German communications. Among them was a woman named Dilly Knox, who worked as a scholar and classical cryptographer, though Knox himself was male. But many of the actual code-breaking work was done by women who had been recruited for their linguistic abilities and mathematical aptitude. During the Second World War, the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, which cracked the German Enigma cipher and is widely credited with shortening the war by perhaps 2 years, employed approximately 10,000 people by the end of the war. Of these, roughly 75% were women. The women of Bletchley Park worked as mathematicians, linguists, analysts, and machine operators. Fact number 39. England was the first country in the world to have a sewer system in every major city. The Great Stink of 1858 was a crisis of truly appalling proportions. London in the mid-19th century was a city of over 2 million people, and the sewage of all of those people went, more or less directly, into the River Thames. The summer of 1858 was exceptionally hot, and the Thames became so overwhelmingly foul that the smell wafting into the Houses of Parliament on the river's bank made it almost impossible for members of Parliament to work. This crisis, paradoxically, proved to be exactly what London needed to force action. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette was authorised to build an entirely new sewer system for London, an engineering achievement of extraordinary scale. Over the following decade, Bazalgette's team laid 1,300 miles of new sewers, built enormous pumping stations, and created this system of embankments along the Thames that still form the riverbank today. The new sewers diverted London's waste away from the drinking water supply, and the immediate result was a dramatic decline in cholera and other waterborne diseases. Factor number 40. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French soldier, but it ended up in Britain. The Rosetta Stone, the ancient Egyptian inscription that provided the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics, was discovered in 1799 by a soldier in Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition. It was found near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta by a French army officer named Pierre-François Bouchard, who recognized its potential significance. The stone, which carries the same text written in 3 scripts, hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Ancient Greek, was seized by British forces after their defeat of the French in Egypt in 1801, under the terms of the Treaty of Alexandria. It was brought to Britain and has been on display at the British Museum since 1802, making it one of the most visited objects in the world. The decipherment of the hieroglyphics was finally achieved by the British polymath Thomas Young and the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in the early 19th century, with Champollion generally credited with the decisive breakthrough in 1822. Fact number 41. Britain's first female doctor had to disguise herself as a man. James Barry was, by all outward appearances, a male army surgeon who served in the British Army for nearly 50 years, rose to the rank of Inspector General, and performed one of the earliest successful caesarean sections in history in Cape Town in 1826. But when Barry died in 1865 and the body was being prepared for burial, the woman who washed the body claimed that Barry was biologically female. This revelation caused an enormous scandal. The army attempted to suppress the information. Barry's service record was sealed for 100 years. Whether Barry identified as a woman, as a man, or in some other way is a question that cannot be definitively answered from the historical record. What is clear is that a person born as Margaret Bulkley in Ireland in approximately 1789 assumed the identity of James Barry to gain access to a medical education and a military career that would have been impossible for a woman. Barry's medical career was genuinely distinguished. Fact number 42. The first speed limit in Britain was 4 miles per hour. When the Locomotive Acts of the 1860s and 1870s imposed speed limits on motor vehicles in Britain, the limits set were so restrictive that they became a source of lasting embarrassment and mockery. The Locomotive Act of 1865, which became known as the Red Flag Act, required that all self-propelled vehicles on public roads travel at no more than 4 miles per hour in the country and 2 miles per hour in towns. Furthermore, the vehicle had to be preceded by a person walking in front of it, carrying a red flag to warn horse-drawn traffic of its approach. The act was explicitly designed to protect the interests of the railway companies and horse-drawn transport operators, who correctly saw the motor vehicle as a threat to their businesses. The practical effect of the Red Flag Act was to hand the lead in motor vehicle development to France and Germany, where no such restrictions existed. Fact number 43. Britain's smallest county once had its own independent parliament. The Isle of Man, a small island in the Irish Sea between Britain and Ireland, is not technically part of the United Kingdom and never has been. It is a crown dependency, meaning it is under the sovereignty of the British Crown, but is not governed by the Westminster Parliament and makes its own laws. More significantly, it has the oldest continuously operating parliament in the world. The Tynwald, as it is called, traces its origins back to the Viking settlement of the island in the 9th and 10th centuries. The name Tynwald comes from the Old Norse for Thingvolla, meaning assembly field. The Tynwald has met continuously for over 1,000 years, making it considerably older than the English Parliament, which developed in the 13th century. Each year on Tynwald Day, the 5th of July, the Tynwald meets outdoors on a ceremonial hill at St. John's in a ceremony that directly echoes its Norse origins. Laws passed by the Tynwald must be promulgated at this ceremony to be valid. Fact number 44. England and France were once united under a single king. For approximately 30 years in the 15th century, England and France were united under the rule of a single monarch. This extraordinary situation came about as a result of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, negotiated between Henry V of England and Charles VI of France. The treaty disinherited the French Dauphin and declared that Henry V and his heirs would be heirs to the French throne. When Henry V died in 1422, followed by Charles VI 2 months later, Henry's infant son became Henry VI of England and Henry II of France simultaneously. The dual monarchy was not accepted by all of France. The Dauphin, who had been disinherited, controlled much of southern France and continued to press his claim. The arrival of Joan of Arc in 1429, her dramatic victories at Orleans and subsequent coronation of the Dauphin as Charles VII, and the eventual English military defeats that followed, led to the gradual unwinding of the dual monarchy. By 1453, the English had lost almost all of their French territories, retaining only the town of Calais, which they held until 1558. Fact number 45. Britain once had a child king who was just 9 months old. The youngest person ever to become a monarch of Scotland was Mary, Queen of Scots, who became Queen of Scotland on the 14th of December 1542 at the age of approximately 6 days. Her father, James V of Scotland, had just died at the age of 30, reportedly of grief after the catastrophic defeat of his army at the Battle of Solway Moss. His infant daughter Mary became queen immediately upon his death. She was only days old, could neither speak nor walk nor understand anything of the world she had been born into. She was crowned at Stirling Castle when she was 9 months old, in a ceremony that must have been extraordinary to witness, with a tiny baby placed on a throne and subjected to all the solemn ritual of a coronation. Mary's life from that point forward was shaped by the extreme vulnerability of her position as a child queen in a country of feuding nobles, religious conflict, and aggressive neighbors. Fact number 46. The Domesday Book is one of the most remarkable documents ever created. In 1085, William the Conqueror, who had been King of England for nearly 20 years, ordered a comprehensive survey of his kingdom. The result was the Domesday Book, completed in 1086, which recorded the ownership, value, and resources of almost every estate in England and parts of Wales. It listed who owned each piece of land, how many people lived on it, what it was worth, and what it had been worth before the Norman conquest. It covered approximately 13,418 settlements and recorded the details of roughly 270,000 households. Nothing like it had ever been attempted before anywhere in the world. The survey was conducted by royal commissioners who travelled across the country, questioning local juries about the ownership and value of land. The information was then compiled and written up in 2 large volumes. Fact number 47. Britain's worst industrial disaster killed more than 400 children. The Aberfan disaster of the 21st of October 1966 is one of the most traumatic events in modern Welsh and British history. Aberfan was a small mining village in the Taff Valley in South Wales, and above it, on the mountainside, sat a series of colliery spoil tips, massive mounds of coal waste that had been accumulating for decades. On a wet October morning, following days of heavy rain, one of the largest tips, tip number 7, suddenly collapsed and slid down the mountain at enormous speed. A torrent of coal slurry, described by survivors as moving like a wave of black porridge, engulfed the village below. It struck Pangloss Junior School first, where children had arrived just 20 minutes earlier for their last day of school before half-term. Of the 144 people who died that day, 116 were children, most of them between the ages of 7 and 10. A subsequent inquiry found that the National Coal Board had known about the risks posed by the tips and had done nothing. The disaster triggered fundamental changes in the regulation of mining waste. Fact number 48. The first person to climb Mount Everest was from New Zealand, but his partner was from Nepal. On the 29th of May 1953, Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay of Nepal became the first people to reach the summit of Mount Everest. The expedition was a British-organised and British-funded endeavour, led by John Hunt of the British Army. The news reached London on the morning of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, the 2nd of June 1953, and was greeted with enormous national celebration. Hillary was immediately knighted, and Hunt received a knighthood as well. Tenzing Norgay received the George Medal, which was a lesser honour, a disparity that was noticed and criticised at the time, and has been discussed critically ever since. The question of who actually stepped onto the summit first, Hillary or Tenzing, was deliberately left ambiguous by the two men at the time and has never been definitively resolved. Hillary later told friends that he had stepped up first, but both men publicly maintained that they had reached the top together. Fact number 49. The British invented the world's first public railway. The Middleton Railway in Leeds, Yorkshire, holds the distinction of being the first railway in the world to be authorised by an Act of Parliament, which it was in 1758. But the railway that truly changed the world was the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened in September 1825 as the world's first public steam railway, carrying both passengers and freight. It was designed by the engineer George Stephenson, who is one of the most important figures in the history of technology. Stephenson was the son of a colliery fireman and had almost no formal education, teaching himself to read as an adult. His locomotive, the Locomotion No. 1, hauled the inaugural train of the Stockton and Darlington Railway at speeds of around 15 miles per hour, which was considerably faster than any horse-drawn vehicle. 5 years later, in 1830, Stephenson's rocket won the Rainhill trials and was chosen to power the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the first intercity passenger railway. Fact number 50. The population of Ireland was halved by the Great Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland, which was then entirely part of the United Kingdom, experienced one of the worst famines in European history. The immediate cause was a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, which destroyed the potato crop on which the majority of Ireland's rural poor depended for the bulk of their diet. But the famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was shaped and profoundly worsened by political decisions made in London. Even as people starved in Ireland, food, including grain, livestock and butter, continued to be exported from the country to Britain, protected by armed guards. The British government's response was inadequate, ideologically driven by a belief in free markets that discouraged direct food distribution, and in some cases actively harmful. Approximately 1 million people died of starvation and famine-related disease. Another million or more emigrated during the famine years, beginning a wave of emigration that would continue for the next century, and would send millions of Irish people to America, Australia, and elsewhere. Fact number 51. Britain's coastline is one of the most complex in the world. If you tried to walk the entire coastline of mainland Britain without taking any shortcuts, you would need to cover approximately 11,000 miles. But this figure is somewhat misleading, because the measured length of a coastline depends entirely on the scale at which you measure it. Use a smaller ruler, measuring around every rock and inlet and crevice, and the number gets larger. Use a larger ruler, smoothing out the smaller irregularities, and the number gets smaller. This phenomenon, known as the coastline paradox and described mathematically by the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, was inspired in part by the question of measuring the coast of Britain specifically. The complexity of Britain's coastline reflects its extraordinary geological diversity. In Cornwall, granite cliffs drop into the Atlantic. In Norfolk, soft sandy beaches and low dunes stretch for miles. In Scotland, the western coast is shattered into hundreds of islands, peninsulas, and sea locks. Fact number 52, the original Stonehenge builders may have come from Wales. Stonehenge is one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world, but there are aspects of its construction that remain genuinely mysterious. The site was built in multiple stages over roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3000 BC to 1500 BC. The earliest phase involved the construction of a circular earthwork enclosure. Later, around 2500 BC, the large sarsen stones were erected, brought from the Marlborough Downs approximately 25 miles north of the site. But there is another set of stones at Stonehenge, the blue stones, which are smaller, darker, and which have a very different origin. Analysis of the blue stones has determined that they came from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire in West Wales, approximately 200 miles away. How prehistoric people without wheeled vehicles or metal tools transported these multi-ton stones from Wales to Wiltshire is a question that has fascinated researchers for generations. Some researchers have proposed that they were moved on rafts along the coast, others that they were dragged overland. Fact number 53. England's greatest naval hero was actually born far from the sea. Horatio Nelson, the admiral who won the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and in doing so secured British naval supremacy for over a century, was born in Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk, a county not particularly associated with the sea. He was the sixth of 11 children of a country parson, a slight, sickly child who joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12. By the time he died at Trafalgar at the age of 47, he had lost the sight of his right eye in battle, lost his right arm in battle, and survived so many engagements and illnesses that his survival seemed almost miraculous. But the personal facts that are less often taught include that Nelson was a deeply complicated and sometimes difficult man. His famous affair with Emma Hamilton, the wife of the British ambassador to Naples, was a source of scandal throughout his later life. He was vain about his fame, and his treatment of some naval officers under his command was harsh. Fact number 54. Britain built the world's first public library open to everyone. The British Museum, founded in 1753 and opening to the public in 1759, was one of the first truly public museums in the world, admitting visitors free of charge on the principle that access to knowledge and culture should be available to all citizens rather than only the wealthy. But the museum's library collection, which would eventually become the British Library, was even more significant in terms of the principle it embodied. The British Museum's reading room, housed in a magnificent circular domed building, completed in 1857, was available to any member of the public who applied for a reader's ticket. Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital there. Virginia Woolf was a regular reader. Gandhi used the library's resources during his years in London. Lenin worked in the reading room during his time in exile in London. The principle of the public library, free access to books for everyone, was embodied in the Public Libraries Act of 1850, which for the first time gave local councils in England and Wales the power to establish free public libraries. Fact number 55. The Curse of Tutankhamun's tomb was partly invented by a British journalist. When the archaeologist Howard Carter, working under the patronage of Lord Carnarvon, opened the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in November 1922, it was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The tomb was almost entirely intact, containing thousands of extraordinary objects, including the famous Golden Death Mask. But the story that captured the world's imagination almost as much as the artifacts themselves was the supposed curse of the pharaoh's tomb. The story was largely fabricated and sensationalized by the journalist Arthur Weigel, who was covering the excavation for British newspapers. When Lord Carnarvon died of blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite in April 1923, just a few months after the tomb was opened, Weigel and others seized on the death as evidence of the pharaoh's curse. Fact number 56. The English longbow changed the nature of medieval warfare. The longbow used by English and Welsh archers in the medieval period was one of the most effective weapons of its age, and its development and deployment changed the nature of medieval warfare in profound ways. A skilled archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute with a longbow, and the arrows were capable of penetrating the armor of knights at ranges of up to 200 meters. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, at Poitiers in 1356, and most famously at Agincourt in 1415, English and Welsh longbowmen decimated French forces that were numerically superior, demonstrating that a relatively cheap weapon wielded by commoners could defeat the armored cavalry of the aristocracy. The longbow required years of training from childhood to master, and the physical demands of drawing a bow with a pull weight of 100 to 160 pounds over a lifetime left permanent deformations on the skeletons of longbowmen. Skeletons identified as those of medieval archers show markedly enlarged left arms, overdeveloped shoulder bones, and distinctive stress fractures. Fact number 57. Britain once had a prime minister who served 3 separate times. William Ewart Gladstone served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom on 4 separate occasions, between 1868 and 1894, a record that has never been equalled. He first became Prime Minister at the age of 58 and last held the office at the age of 84. His career in Parliament spanned 62 years, from 1832 to 1894, making him one of the longest-serving members of Parliament in British history. Gladstone was a man of enormous energy and moral seriousness. He read extensively throughout his long life and reportedly read over 20,000 books. He was deeply religious and spent some of his evenings undertaking charitable work with women who had been driven to prostitution, an activity that his critics found deeply suspicious, but which he maintained was genuinely motivated by Christian charity. He was also a passionate advocate for Irish Home Rule, the granting of self-government to Ireland, which he pursued in his final years in office against the fierce opposition of many in his own Liberal Party. Fact number 58. A British scientist discovered that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and nobody believed her. This fact requires a small correction in advance. The astronomer in question was not British, but the discovery she made was demonstrated partly through observations conducted in Britain, and had a profound effect on British scientific thought. But let us instead tell the story of Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, who was born in England in 1900 and who made one of the most significant discoveries in the history of astronomy. Studying at Cambridge and then at Harvard, Payne-Gaposchkin analyzed the spectra of stars and concluded in her 1925 doctoral thesis that stars were composed primarily of hydrogen and helium. This was a revolutionary finding that contradicted the prevailing scientific consensus, which held that stars had a similar chemical composition to the Earth. The astronomer Henry Norris Russell, one of the most respected figures in the field, persuaded her to add a note to her thesis, saying that her conclusion was almost certainly wrong. 4 years later, Russell arrived at the same conclusion independently, published it, and received much of the credit. Fact number 59. The British Empire introduced cricket to the world, and the world beat them at it. Cricket is a sport that was codified in England in the 18th century, spread throughout the British Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries, and is now played competitively at the highest level primarily by countries that were once British colonies, several of which are considerably better at the game than England. The first Test match, the highest form of cricket, was played between England and Australia in Melbourne in 1877. Australia won. The following decades established the Ashes series between England and Australia as one of the great sporting rivalries in the world. The West Indies produced some of the most dazzling cricketers of the 20th century, and their dominance of world cricket through the 1970s and 1980s was achieved partly through the desire to beat the former colonial power at its own game. India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh all developed cricket traditions that are now vast, complex, and passionately supported by hundreds of millions of people. Fact number 60. The first successful aeroplane flight in Britain was made on a beach in Essex. In the history of powered flight, the Wright brothers' achievement at Kitty Hawk in December 1903 is the most celebrated milestone, but Britain was not far behind. On the 16th of October 1908, the American aviator Samuel Franklin Cody, who had settled in Britain and was working for the British Army, made the first recognized powered flight in the United Kingdom at Farnborough in Hampshire, covering approximately 423 meters. But earlier in the same year, on the 13th of May, there was a flight in Britain that some historians argue has an equally strong claim to the title of first British powered flight. John William Dunn, a British Army officer and inventor, flew a biplane on a beach at Blair Athol in Scotland. The specific claims of priority are genuinely complicated. What is clear is that British aviation, once it got started, developed with extraordinary speed. By 1919, the British pilots John Alcock and Arthur Brown had made the first non-stop transatlantic flight, crossing from Newfoundland to Ireland in a converted Vickers-Vimy bomber. Fact number 61. Scotland had a parliament 400 years before England did. This statement requires some nuance, but contains a genuine historical truth. The Scottish Parliament, known in its medieval form as the Estates of Scotland, was meeting from at least the 13th century, around the same time as the English Parliament was developing. But the Scottish Parliament had distinctive features that gave it a different character from the English institution. It included representatives of the burghs, the Scottish towns, as a separate estate from a very early period, whereas English towns were not formally represented in Parliament until later. The Scottish Parliament also retained powers and independence that the English Parliament fought for over centuries. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, uniting the two crowns, Scotland retained its own parliament. The Scottish Parliament continued to meet until the Acts of Union in 1707, which merged the Scottish and English parliaments into the Parliament of Great Britain and abolished the separate Scottish institution. Fact number 62. The penny post was one of Britain's most radical democratic reforms. Before 1840, the British postal system operated on a complex system of charges that made sending a letter expensive and confusing. The cost of postage was generally paid by the recipient, not the sender, and it varied according to the distance traveled and the number of sheets of paper used. Sending a letter from one end of the country to the other could cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a working person. The result was that cheap, easy communication was effectively limited to those who could afford it. In 1840, a reformer named Rowland Hill convinced the government to implement a radical new system. Under the penny post, any letter weighing up to half an ounce could be sent anywhere in the United Kingdom for a single penny, paid in advance by the sender using a small adhesive stamp, the world's first postage stamp, known as the penny black. The effect was transformative. In the first year of the penny post, the number of letters sent in Britain more than doubled. Within a decade, it had increased tenfold. Fact number 63. Britain's first parliament was held in a tent. The origins of the English parliament are complex and contested, but one significant early gathering was the parliament that Simon de Montfort convened in 1265. De Montfort, who was the Earl of Leicester and the leader of a baronial rebellion against King Henry III, summoned representatives of the knights of the shires and the burgesses of the towns to join the great lords in a parliament, the first time that ordinary citizens had been invited to participate in a national assembly of this kind. This assembly is sometimes described as the first parliament in the modern sense, the first to include representatives of the commons alongside the great magnates. De Montfort's parliament was held at Westminster, but it met in circumstances of considerable political turbulence. De Montfort himself was killed later that year at the Battle of Evesham, but the precedent he set of including non-aristocratic representatives in national governance proved lasting. Fact number 64. The world's first computer was built by a British man in the 19th century. Charles Babbage was a mathematician and inventor who spent much of his adult life attempting to build a mechanical calculating machine. His first project, the difference engine, was a device capable of performing polynomial calculations automatically, designed to replace the laborious and error-prone process of calculating mathematical tables by hand. The British government funded the project with what was at the time an extraordinary sum of money, approximately £17,000, equivalent to many millions today. But the difference engine was never completed in Babbage's lifetime, partly because of engineering difficulties and partly because of disputes with his chief engineer. Babbage then conceived a far more ambitious project, the analytical engine, which was to be a general-purpose mechanical computer capable of performing any mathematical calculation, and of being programmed using punched cards borrowed from the jacket loom. Fact number 65. Britain's national anthem has words. Almost nobody sings God Save the King, or God Save the Queen, depending on the monarch, is one of the oldest national anthems in the world and has been used as a model by many other countries. It was first performed publicly in 1745 during the Jacobite Rebellion as a show of loyalty to King George II. But most people who sing the anthem at sporting events or official occasions know only the first verse. The song actually has multiple verses, including some that are almost never sung in public today. One verse, present in some early versions, calls for rebellion against the Jacobites to be crushed and for their political ambitions to be frustrated. Another verse, specific to Scotland, was added later and is sung at Scottish sporting events. The sixth verse of the anthem, in some versions, explicitly celebrates British military victories over the Scots, which makes its use in a unified British context somewhat awkward. Fact number 66. A Scottish doctor invented the waterproof raincoat. Charles Mackintosh was a chemist born in Glasgow in 1766, who spent much of his career looking for practical applications for coal tar naphtha, a byproduct of the gas-making industry. In 1823, he discovered that dissolving rubber in coal tar naphtha and spreading the resulting solution between layers of fabric produced a material that was flexible, durable, and waterproof. He patented the process and began manufacturing waterproof garments in Manchester in partnership with a textile manufacturer. The coats produced by this process were the first practical waterproof raincoats and were an immediate commercial success. The garments were initially quite stiff, had a strong smell, became brittle in cold weather and sticky in warm weather, and were not entirely beloved by their wearers, but the basic concept was revolutionary. As the technology for working with rubber improved through the 19th century, the quality of the raincoats improved as well. Fact number 67. The most successful pirate in history may have been British. Henry Avery, also known as Henry Avery or Long Ben, was an English pirate who operated in the 1690s and who pulled off what has been described as the most profitable act of piracy in recorded history. In September 1695, Avery and his crew attacked a convoy of ships belonging to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in the Red Sea, near the coast of modern Yemen. The largest ship in the convoy, the Ganges Sawai, was one of the most heavily armed vessels in the Indian Ocean, carrying 80 guns and a crew of 400. Avery's crew of roughly 160 men attacked and captured the ship in a brutal battle. The treasure they took was enormous. Estimates suggest the haul included several £100,000 in gold and silver, along with jewels and other valuables, making it one of the richest prizes ever taken by pirates. Avery became the most wanted man in the world, with the English and Mughal empires both offering large rewards for his capture. He was never caught. His subsequent fate is unknown. Fact number 68. The first photographs of Britain were taken in the same year. Victoria became queen. William Henry Fox Talbot was an English scientist and inventor who was working on the problem of fixing photographic images at the same time as the French inventor Louis Daguerre, and the two men are generally credited as the co-inventors of photography, though their processes were quite different. Fox Talbot's process, which he called the calotype, used paper coated with silver salts to produce a negative image that could then be used to print positive copies. His earliest successful photographic images date to around 1834 or 1835. In 1839, the same year that Victoria became queen, he published his process publicly in response to the announcement of Daguerre's process in France. Fox Talbot's calotype process was ultimately more important than the daguerreotype because it allowed multiple copies to be made from a single negative, which is the basis of all subsequent photographic and printing technology. Fact number 69. Britain once fought a war over a pig. In 1859, a boundary dispute between the United States and Britain over a small island in the Pacific Northwest came within inches of becoming an armed conflict, and the trigger was a pig. San Juan Island, which lies in the waters between Vancouver Island and the mainland of what is now Washington State, was claimed by both the United States and Britain under the terms of an 1846 treaty that had failed to specify precisely where the boundary ran. Both sides had settlers on the island. In June 1859, an American settler named Lyman Cutler shot a pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company after it repeatedly got into his garden and ate his potatoes. The pig's owner demanded compensation. Cutler refused. British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler. American settlers requested military protection. Within weeks, both sides had landed soldiers on the tiny island, and for a brief period, roughly 461 American soldiers faced 5 British warships carrying 2,140 men. Remarkably, cooler heads prevailed on both sides. Fact number 70. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and many other British bands were taught by the same blues records. This is a fact about cultural history rather than political or military history, but it is no less significant for that. The British music scene of the late 1950s and early 1960s was transformed by the arrival in Britain of American blues and rhythm and blues records, brought over by sailors, GIs, and enthusiastic collectors. Young musicians in London, Liverpool, Manchester, and elsewhere heard recordings by Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard, and were electrified by them. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones has described hearing Chuck Berry for the first time as a life-changing moment. John Lennon and Paul McCartney of the Beatles built their early repertoire largely from American rock and roll and rhythm and blues. The British invasion of America in the 1960s, led by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, was in a very real sense Americans getting their own music back, transformed, electrified, and reflected through the prism of young British working-class experience. Fact number 71. Britain's lowest point is below sea level and is in Cambridgeshire. The lowest point in Britain is a place called Holme Fen in Cambridgeshire, which sits at approximately 2.75 metres below sea level. It is not a natural depression, but a consequence of land drainage. The Fenlands of East Anglia, a vast, flat landscape stretching across parts of Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and Suffolk, were once a huge area of marsh, fen, and shallow water. In the 17th century, Dutch engineers, led by Cornelius Vermuyden, were employed to drain the fens, creating agricultural land from what had previously been wetland. The drainage was extraordinarily effective, and the fens became some of the most productive agricultural land in Britain, but there was an unforeseen consequence. The peat soils of the fens, when dried out, oxidize and compact. This means the land has been slowly sinking ever since drainage began. In some places, the fens have sunk by up to 4 metres since the 17th century. At Holme Fen, a cast iron post was driven into the ground in 1851 until its top was level with the surrounding peat surface. Fact number 72. The world's first novel in English, written by a black British author, changed literature. Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship crossing the Atlantic in approximately 1729 and was named after the fictional character Don Quixote's servant. He was enslaved and brought to England as a small child, given as a gift to 3 sisters. Through a combination of his own intelligence, the patronage of the Duke of Montagu, and his own extraordinary determination, Sancho educated himself, became a writer, a composer, and eventually a grocer, and in 1782 became the first known person of African descent to vote in a British election. But his most lasting literary legacy was his correspondence. The Letters of Ignatius Sancho, published in 1782 after his death, was a collection of his letters that became an immediate bestseller, and went through 5 editions within 30 years. The letters are vivid, witty, compassionate, and deeply human, discussing politics, art, friendship, and the experience of being black in 18th century Britain. Fact number 73. Britain once employed child chimney sweeps as young as 4 years old. The practice of sending small children up the inside of chimneys to clean them was one of the most brutal features of British urban life in the 18th and 19th centuries. Chimney sweeps used children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old, to climb inside the narrow flues of domestic and industrial chimneys. The children were expected to climb in the dark, with their knees and elbows pressed against the sides of the flue, brushing soot loose as they went. The work caused severe physical damage. Children developed twisted spines and deformed knees from being forced to climb while their bodies were still forming. Soot caused a specific form of scrotal cancer that was particularly common among chimney sweeps. Children suffered from eye damage, respiratory disease, and burns. Many fell or were overcome by fumes or became trapped. The practice was reformed only gradually, and against significant resistance from the sweep masters who profited from it. Jonas Hanway campaigned against child sweeps in the 1770s. Fact number 74. Britain's most famous fictional detective was based on a real person. Sherlock Holmes, the fictional detective created by Arthur Conan Doyle, is one of the most recognizable characters in world literature and has been portrayed on film, television, and stage more times than almost any other fictional character. But Holmes was not entirely a product of Conan Doyle's imagination. He was substantially based on a real person, a surgeon named Joseph Bell, who taught at the University of Edinburgh Medical School and who was famous for his ability to deduce astonishing amounts of information about his patients from the smallest physical observations. Bell could reportedly determine a patient's occupation, recent activities, and character from details of their hands, posture, clothing, and bearing, before they had said a word. Conan Doyle was Bell's student assistant at Edinburgh and later wrote to him saying that "To you I owe Sherlock Holmes." Bell acknowledged the compliment and was clearly delighted by it. But there were other influences on Holmes as well, including Edgar Allan Poe's detective C. Fact number 75. The British invented the World Wide Web, not the Internet. There is a crucial distinction that is often blurred in popular discussion of the history of the Internet. The Internet itself, the underlying network of interconnected computers, was developed in the United States, emerging from the ARPANET project of the 1960s and 1970s. But the World Wide Web, the system of hyperlinked documents that most people mean when they say Internet, was invented by a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee. Berners-Lee, who was born in London and educated at Oxford, was working as a software engineer at the Particle Physics Laboratory CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, when he wrote a proposal in 1989 for a system of linked information that could be shared across the Internet using a new protocol he called Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP. In 1991, the first website went live. Berners-Lee chose not to patent his invention and instead released it freely to the world, a decision that allowed the web to grow with extraordinary speed. Fact number 76. Britain's oldest continuously operating business is a hotel. The question of which is Britain's oldest continuously operating business is a matter of genuine historical debate, but one of the strongest candidates is the Bingley Arms pub in Bardsey, West Yorkshire, which claims to date from 905 AD, making it potentially over 1,000 years old. Records of the building and its use as a hostelry, a place where travelers could eat, drink, and sleep, stretch back into the medieval period, and the building itself contains fabric that appears to date from that era. Other claimants include the Old Trip to Jerusalem pub in Nottingham, which is built into caves beneath Nottingham Castle and claims to date from 1189, the year of Richard the Lionheart's coronation. The Bingley Arms predates it significantly if its claimed origins are accepted. What is extraordinary about these ancient inns is not just their age, but the continuity of their function. The same basic service, providing food, drink, and shelter to travelers, has been offered from the same building in the same place for 1,000 years. Fact number 77. A Scottish scientist discovered that bacteria could be killed by mold. In September 1928, Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory at St Mary's Hospital in London after a holiday and found that a culture of Staphylococcus bacteria he had left out before he left had been contaminated by a mold, Penicillium notatum, and that in the area around the mold, the bacteria had been killed. Fleming recognized that the mold was producing a substance that was toxic to the bacteria. He called it penicillin and published his findings, but he had difficulty isolating the active compound and eventually moved on to other research. For more than a decade, penicillin remained an interesting curiosity rather than a practical medical tool. Then, in 1939 and 1940, a team at Oxford University, led by the Australian scientist Howard Florey and the German refugee Ernst Chain, developed a method for extracting and purifying penicillin in sufficient quantities for clinical use. The first human trials in 1941 were dramatic. A patient who was dying of a blood infection was given penicillin and recovered almost immediately. Fact number 78. The British Navy used lime juice to prevent a disease that killed sailors for centuries. Scurvy, a disease caused by severe vitamin C deficiency, killed enormous numbers of sailors during the age of sail. The symptoms are deeply unpleasant, beginning with fatigue and pain, and progressing to the reopening of old wounds, the loss of teeth, and eventually death. The British Navy lost more sailors to scurvy over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries than to enemy action. The cause and cure of scurvy were empirically understood, at least in rough terms, long before the vitamin was identified. In 1747, the Scottish naval surgeon James Lind conducted what is sometimes described as the first clinical trial in the history of medicine. He divided a group of scurvy-afflicted sailors into pairs and gave each pair a different dietary supplement, including 2 oranges and a lemon, vinegar, seawater, and other substances. The pair receiving the citrus fruit recovered within a week. The others did not. Fact number 79. Britain's most famous military defeat was in America. The surrender of General Cornwallis to George Washington at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781, effectively ended the American Revolutionary War and secured American independence. The defeat was not just a military setback, it was a profound shock to British confidence and political life. Britain had expected to suppress the rebellion relatively quickly. The colonial militia were not considered a serious military force. But the combination of the Americans' knowledge of the terrain, the tenacious leadership of Washington, French military and naval assistance, and a series of British strategic miscalculations produced a defeat that stunned the nation. When the news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly reacted as if he had been shot. He paced the room saying, "Oh God, it is all over and over again." The defeat led directly to the fall of North's government and opened a period of political reform. Fact number 80. The entire British royal family changed their name during World War I. At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the British royal family's official name was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German dynastic name inherited through Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who had been a German prince. As war with Germany intensified and anti-German sentiment in Britain grew, the German name became increasingly awkward. In 1917, King George V made the decision to officially change the royal family's name to the House of Windsor, after Windsor Castle in Berkshire. Other members of the royal family who had German names or titles were encouraged to anglicise them as well. The Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, who was George V's cousin, reportedly responded to the name change by suggesting he was looking forward to seeing the next production of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a joke at Shakespeare's expense. The change was not purely cosmetic. It reflected a genuine effort by the monarchy to present itself as thoroughly British, at a time when national unity was essential. Fact number 81. The first London Underground line ran on steam trains. The London Underground, which opened in January 1863, was the world's first urban underground railway, and its first line, the Metropolitan Railway, ran between Paddington and Farringdon Street using steam locomotives. The idea of running steam trains underground seems alarming from a modern perspective, and in practice it was exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. The tunnels filled with smoke and steam, the air was thick with soot and sulfur, and passengers were advised to keep their windows closed, though this did little to improve conditions. Contemporary accounts describe the atmosphere inside the tunnels as almost unbreathable during rush hours. The railway's promoters attempted to minimize these concerns by arguing that the special mix of steam and air in the tunnels was actually beneficial to health, which was not persuasive. Electric traction was gradually introduced from the 1890s onward, and the last steam-hauled service on the Underground ran in 1961 on the Metropolitan line. Fact number 82. Scotland's Declaration of Independence was signed 700 years ago and still resonates today. The Declaration of Arbroath, signed on the 6th of April 1320, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of democracy. It was a letter sent by the Scottish nobility to Pope John XXII, asserting Scotland's independence from England and asking for papal recognition of Robert the Bruce as the legitimate King of Scotland. The English King Edward II had been claiming sovereignty over Scotland, and Scotland had been fighting a long, brutal war of independence. But the Declaration contains a passage that goes far beyond the ordinary claims of feudal politics. It states that even if Robert the Bruce himself were to submit to English rule, the Scots would choose another king to defend their freedom, because it is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. Fact number 83. The gunpowder plot failed partly because of a letter. On the night of the 4th to 5th of November 1605, Guy Fawkes was discovered in the cellars beneath the Houses of Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to demolish the building entirely. The discovery of the gunpowder plot, in which a group of English Catholic conspirators planned to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, kill King James I, and trigger a Catholic uprising, has been celebrated as Bonfire Night, or Guy Fawkes Night in Britain ever since. But how was the plot discovered? A crucial element was a letter sent anonymously to Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer, warning him not to attend the opening of Parliament and speaking cryptically of a terrible blow to be struck against the Protestant government. Monteagle showed the letter to the Privy Council. The cellars beneath Parliament were searched on the night of November 4th, and Fawkes was found. Historians have debated ever since who sent the letter and why. Fact number 84. Britain's oldest living trees are thousands of years old. The yew tree at Fordingle in Perthshire, Scotland, is believed by many botanists to be the oldest living organism in Europe, with estimates of its age ranging from 3,000 to 9,000 years. If the upper estimates are correct, this tree was already ancient when the pyramids were being built in Egypt. Yew trees are extraordinarily difficult to age precisely because their trunks often hollow out with age, destroying the rings that allow most trees to be dated. The Fordingle yew, which grows in the churchyard of a small Scottish village, has fragmented over the centuries into several separate sections, but they are all part of the same original organism. Ancient yew trees of comparable age are found in churchyards across Britain, where they were protected by the sanctity of the church grounds. Many churchyard yews predate the churches they stand beside by centuries or millennia. Fact number 85. The British East India Company once had its own private army larger than the British Army. The East India Company, founded in 1600 by royal charter as a trading company to conduct commerce with the East Indies, eventually became something far more extraordinary than a commercial enterprise. At its height in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it governed large parts of India on behalf of the British Crown and maintained its own private army of approximately 260,000 soldiers, which was twice the size of the British Army at the time. This private force fought wars, suppressed rebellions, and expanded the company's territory across the Indian subcontinent. The company issued its own coins, maintained its own diplomatic service, and negotiated treaties with foreign powers. It collected taxes from millions of people. It grew and exported opium. It fought 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. It effectively ran a subcontinental empire in its own name for private profit, distributing dividends to its shareholders in London. Fact number 86. Britain once had a king who went mad and talked to a tree. King George III of Britain, who reigned from 1760 to 1820, and who is perhaps best known internationally as the king against whom the Americans rebelled, suffered from a severe mental illness that affected him repeatedly throughout his reign and permanently incapacitated him in his final decade. The exact nature of his illness has been debated by historians and medical researchers for generations. For a long time, the leading theory was porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause neurological symptoms. More recently, some researchers have argued that he showed symptoms consistent with bipolar disorder, and that his physical symptoms may have been caused by the arsenic in his medicine. During his most severe episodes, he talked and wrote incessantly, made bizarre statements, and reportedly held extended conversations with an oak tree in Windsor Great Park, under the impression that it was the King of Prussia. His behavior was terrifying to those around him and caused a major constitutional crisis. Fact number 87. The British suffragettes used some of the most radical tactics in political history. The campaign for women's right to vote in Britain, which reached its most intense phase in the years between 1905 and 1914, involved tactics that shocked Edwardian society. The suffragettes of the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, moved from peaceful petition to direct action to outright militancy, as successive governments failed to act. They chained themselves to railings, smashed shop windows, set fire to postboxes, planted bombs, slashed paintings in public galleries, and disrupted public meetings. Emily Wilding Davison threw herself under the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in June 1913, and died of her injuries, making her the movement's most famous martyr. Suffragettes who were imprisoned often went on hunger strike, and the government ordered them to be force-fed through tubes inserted through the nose, a painful and dangerous procedure that generated enormous public sympathy for the women and outrage at the government. Fact number 88. Britain's smallest island. With a permanent resident population is tiny beyond imagination. The Orkney Archipelago in northern Scotland contains an island called Papastor, and until recently, it had a permanent population of fewer than 20 people. But the smallest inhabited island in the British Isles by population is generally considered to be Eilean Moor in the Flannan Isles, which is not inhabited at all but has a lighthouse. The smallest islands with genuine permanent residents are various tiny outposts around the British coastline. But one of the most extraordinary examples of a tiny, isolated British community is the island of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, which is a British overseas territory and the most remote inhabited island in the world. The nearest land is St. Helena, 2,430 kilometers away. Tristan da Cunha has a permanent population of around 250 people, all of whom share a small number of surnames because they are descended from the original settlers of the island. The island has no airport. The only way to get there is by boat from Cape Town, a journey of about 6 days. Fact number 89. The Magna Carta was almost immediately ignored by the king who signed it. The Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was sealed by King John at Runnymede on the 15th of June 1215 and is celebrated as one of the foundational documents of democracy and the rule of law. But within weeks of sealing it, John wrote to Pope Innocent III asking him to annul the charter, which the Pope duly did, calling it shameful, demeaning, illegal, and unjust. John was already gathering foreign mercenaries to suppress the barons who had forced the charter on him when he died unexpectedly in October 1216, leaving his 9-year-old son to inherit both the kingdom and the civil war. The regent for the young Henry III reissued Magna Carta in slightly modified form as a way of rallying support to the young king's cause. It was reissued again and again over the following centuries, gradually embedding itself in English legal and constitutional consciousness. Of the 63 clauses in the original Magna Carta, only 3 remain on the statute book today. Fact number 90. Britain's connection to Australia began as a prison colony. The story of how Australia became British begins with a crisis in the British prison system. Before the American Revolution, Britain had transported tens of thousands of convicted criminals to the American colonies as indentured laborers. After independence in 1776, this option disappeared, and the prisons became desperately overcrowded. Old ships anchored in the Thames estuary, called hulks, were converted into floating prisons, but they too filled quickly. The solution proposed by Joseph Banks, who had sailed with James Cook on his voyages to the Pacific, was to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay on the east coast of Australia, which Cook had claimed for Britain in 1770. The first fleet, carrying 750 convicts and about 250 marines and officials, left Portsmouth in May 1787 under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, and arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788. Finding Botany Bay unsuitable, Phillip moved the fleet to Port Jackson, now Sydney Harbour, and on the 26th of January 1788, he formally established the colony of New South Wales. Fact number 91. The British invented the concept of the weekend. The 2-day weekend, now a fundamental feature of working life across much of the world, was not a natural feature of human society. It was invented gradually in 19th century Britain through the interaction of religious practice, trade union activism, and factory management. The Victorian era in Britain saw the gradual emergence of Saturday afternoon as a half-holiday for factory workers. This developed partly because of the religious observance of the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, which led factory owners employing Jewish workers to close early, and partly because of Christian evangelism encouraging workers to have time to prepare for Sunday worship. The trade union movement fought for and gradually won the 8-hour working day and the 5-day working week. By the early 20th century, the Saturday half-day had expanded to a full day off, creating the 2-day weekend as we know it. The phrase weekend itself appears in English in the 1870s. Fact number 92. Britain's most famous monument, Stonehenge, was once in private hands. For most of its history, Stonehenge stood on private land and was accessible to anyone who wanted to visit it. In 1901, the landowner Sir Edmund Antrobus fenced the site and began charging for admission. When Antrobus died without an heir in 1915, the estate including Stonehenge was put up for auction. It was bought at auction on the 21st of September 1915, during the First World War, by a local businessman named Cecil Chubb for the sum of £6,600. Chubb had attended the auction apparently on a whim, and later claimed he had bought it as a gift for his wife, who did not particularly want it. 3 years after buying it, in 1918, Chubb gave Stonehenge to the British nation, donating it to the Office of Works. He was knighted for his generosity. Today, Stonehenge is managed by English Heritage and receives over 1.5 million visitors a year. The surrounding landscape, which includes hundreds of associated prehistoric monuments and burial mounds, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Fact number 93. The British Empire once deliberately went to war to sell drugs. The Opium Wars of the 19th century are among the most straightforwardly indefensible episodes in British imperial history. In the early 19th century, British merchants, largely through the East India Company, were importing enormous quantities of opium grown in India into China. The Chinese government, alarmed by the social devastation caused by widespread opium addiction, and by the drain of silver flowing out of China to pay for the drug, repeatedly tried to ban the trade. In 1839, the Chinese commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed over 1,000 tons of opium belonging to British merchants, and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to support the ban on moral grounds. The British government's response was to send a naval and military expedition to China. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, ended with China's defeat and the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to open its ports to British trade, pay a substantial indemnity, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Fact number 94. The last wolf in Britain was killed over 300 years ago. Wolves once ranged across the entire British Isles. The last wolves in England are believed to have been killed sometime in the 15th or 16th century. The last wolf in Ireland is thought to have been killed in 1786. The last wolf in Scotland, according to tradition, was killed in 1680 by a hunter named Sir Ewan Cameron in Perthshire. The precise date is uncertain and disputed, but it is broadly accepted that Scotland had no wolves by the end of the 17th century. The extinction of the wolf in Britain was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of systematic hunting, driven by the very real threat that wolves posed to sheep, cattle, and in some cases children. Medieval English kings offered bounties for wolf kills. Communities organized wolf hunts. The forest clearances that came with agricultural expansion destroyed the habitat wolves needed. Fact number 95. British scientists discovered the structure of DNA. On the 28th of February 1953, Francis Crick, a British physicist, and James Watson, an American biologist, working at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, concluded that they had discovered the double helix structure of deoxyribonucleic acid, the molecule that carries genetic information in living organisms. Their discovery was based partly on their own model-building work and partly on X-ray crystallography data produced by the British scientist Rosalind Franklin at King's College London. Franklin's work, particularly an X-ray photograph known as Photo 51, provided crucial evidence for the double helix structure. The controversial aspect of this story is that Franklin's data was shown to Watson without her knowledge or permission by her colleague Maurice Wilkins, and its contribution to the discovery was not fully acknowledged in the original 1953 paper. In 1962, Crick, Watson, and Wilkins were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery. Fact number 96. The town of Rye in East Sussex was once a major port and a target of French raids. The small, picturesque town of Rye in East Sussex, with its cobblestone streets and its medieval church tower, looks today like the quintessential quiet English market town, but its history is extraordinary. In the medieval period, Rye was one of the most important ports in southern England, a member of the Cinque Ports Confederation, which provided ships and men to the crown in exchange for special privileges. The sea that once surrounded Rye on three sides has long since retreated due to coastal changes, leaving the town stranded miles inland from the current coastline. In its heyday, Rye was also the target of repeated French raids. In 1377, a French force attacked and burned much of the town. The French raiders reportedly took the church bells as trophies. The people of Rye launched a retaliatory raid into France, retrieved the bells, and brought them back. The bells of St. Mary's Church, which still hang in the tower today, are known as the Rye bells and have been ringing over the town for over 600 years. Fact number 97. Britain's first female prime minister changed the country permanently. Margaret Thatcher became the first female prime minister of the United Kingdom in May 1979, and she remained in office until November 1990, making her the longest-serving British prime minister of the 20th century. She was also the first woman to lead a major Western nation in the modern era. Thatcher's 11 years in power were among the most consequential in modern British history, and they remain deeply contested. Her economic policies, which included the privatisation of nationalised industries, the deregulation of financial markets, cuts to public spending, and a systematic confrontation with trade union power, transformed the British economy and influenced economic policy around the world. The defeat of the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985, the longest and most bitter industrial dispute in modern British history, was a defining moment of her premiership that still resonates in former mining communities. Fact number 98. Britain's longest reigning monarch was a woman, Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from February 1952 until her death in September 2022, was the longest reigning monarch in British history and the longest reigning female monarch in recorded history. She reigned for 70 years and 214 days. During her reign, she witnessed the transformation of Britain from a global imperial power to a medium-sized post-industrial nation, presided over the dissolution of much of the British Empire and the emergence of the Commonwealth, welcomed 15 prime ministers from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, and maintained a consistent presence of dignity and duty that attracted admiration and respect across the political spectrum and around the world. She was also the longest-serving head of state of any country in the world at the time of her death, having outlasted presidents, kings, generals, and dictators who had come and gone during her reign. The consistency of her presence over 7 decades, in a world of extraordinary change, gave her a unique authority. Fact number 99. The British coal industry once employed over 1 million people. At the height of Britain's coal mining industry, in the years around the First World War, approximately 1.2 million people were employed in mining coal in Britain. Coal was the foundation of the British economy. It powered the steam engines that drove the factories. It heated the homes. It fueled the ships that carried British trade around the world. The coalfields of South Wales, Yorkshire, Durham, Northumberland, the Midlands, and Scotland were the engine rooms of the industrial economy. The communities that grew up around the pits had their own distinct culture, their own music, their own politics, and their own sense of identity. Mining was extraordinarily dangerous. Cave-ins, gas explosions, flooding, and respiratory disease took lives in enormous numbers. The Senghenydd colliery explosion of 1913 in South Wales killed 439 men and boys in the worst mining accident in British history. The industry declined steadily through the 20th century as oil, gas, and nuclear power provided alternatives, and as cheaper coal from abroad undercut domestic production. Fact number 100: Britain is still discovering its own history. This final fact is perhaps the most remarkable of all. After all that we have covered tonight, after 100 stories drawn from 5,000 years of history, the most extraordinary truth about Britain's past is that it is still being discovered. Every year, archaeologists excavating building sites, farmers ploughing their fields, detectorists walking across open countryside with metal detectors, marine archaeologists exploring submerged coasts, and scholars working through ancient documents and archives continue to find new evidence that changes and deepens our understanding of what happened in this archipelago of islands. In recent years, new discoveries have included the footprints of prehistoric children preserved in the silt of the Severn Estuary, over 7,000 years old, burial chambers belonging to cultures that left no other trace, Roman roads that nobody knew existed, Viking longships buried in Scottish river mud, medieval manuscripts that rewrite the early history of English literature. And so we come gently to the end of our journey, through 100 rare and remarkable facts from the long, deep, and extraordinary history of the British Isles. 100 windows, each opening onto a different room in the great house of the past. We have travelled from the ancient trackways of the prehistoric landscape to the footsteps of the first printing press, from the salt air of Viking longships to the dark tunnels of Victorian mines, from the great walls of Rome's empire to the corridors of Bletchley Park. These are the stories that fall between the lines of official history, the ones that textbooks rarely have room for, the ones that remind us how strange and surprising and deeply human the past really is. Let these stories settle into your rest tonight, each one a small ember of the past glowing softly. Let them drift through your sleep like river water moving over ancient patient stone. And if they spark a question, or a wonder, or a quiet desire to look further into the past, then they have done what stories are meant to do: sleep gently. History is all around you. And it has been waiting a very long time indeed for someone like you to listen.